Welcome to an LGBT plus ancient history think tank hosted by Academus Education affiliated with the Classical Association. Tonight we're joined by Meg Finlayson talking about queer coding and constructing masculinity in classical films. Meg graduated with a BA Honours degree in Classical Studies from the University of Winchester in 2018, with a Masters in Classics from the University of Edinburgh in 2019, and has recently completed their M.Lit in Classics at the University of St Andrews. Her research interests include presentations of power and construction of royal identity in art and literature, and the campaigns and reception of Alexander the Great. Meg is also interested in the role of classics as part of her LGBTQ+ history and culture.
Today I will be speaking on guyliner, gladrags, and gladiators, so queer coding and constructing masculinity in classical film. So when I use the word queer coding, to put it in its simplest form, it's a word that's kind of come to more prominence recently in some online, a lot of media criticism really is when we tend to see the word queer coding. But it's quite a complex phrase that really sort of tends to denote when characters or when individuals that are portrayed on screen or in any form of media really have characteristics that may be attributed to queer people, be this a style of dress, be this intonation in speech, or interpersonal relationships with other characters. And yet this idea of their actual gender or sexuality that may be queer goes unspoken. And so we are left with coded characteristics that have an implication, but not necessarily a realized reality. So to give a little background on queer coding and what some of it is influenced by, so go back, sorry, my fault. There we are. So back in the 1920s to the 1940s, we had what was called the Motion Picture Production Code, which is also nicknamed the Hays Code after the main president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America between the 20s and the 40s. And what this production code did was it put certain limitations on what could be depicted on screen. There's an extensive list of what it impacted upon, including things such as drug use, including things such as murder, and anything that was slightly perceived as being taboo. It really restricted on how and why these things could be depicted on screen, and it influenced a lot of the content that was produced in the English-speaking world, in Hollywood particularly. During these years, it eventually fell out of popularity in the 1950s and 60s as filmmakers began to reintroduce taboo topics to quite great acclaim. But prior to that, it had quite a severe influence on what could be depicted on screen. And this is where we get the sort of origins of queer coding, because when we look at queer characters nowadays in modernity, there's quite an anticipation of having queer characters existing for a sense of representation. So they're not queer for any particular motivation. They are represented on screen as authentically realized queer characters, simply because being queer, be that gay, bisexual, transgender, is a normal part of life, and there are normal people like that who may be part of these stories that we see on screen. But this is a fairly modern and recent idea of what it means to be queer on screen, because obviously being gay, transgender, etc., and when we look at the long history of the presentation of screen and film, it's not something that was readily put forth explicitly, not just because it was illegal for a long time and because legality has only slowly been introduced for these ways of being, which is quite a terrible shame. But when we look at queer coding, it's kind of the unspoken truths of what it was to be queer on screen. And often characters were queer coded because it's tied into this idea of motivation. One of the big things that the Hays Code changed about depicting things on screen is the idea that there always had to be an underlying motivation. So in one example, you couldn't have murder simply for murder's sake. Everything had to be motivated as sort of a revenge murder or for some reason, because if it was murder for murder's sake, then it's psychopathy. It's something that's not explainable, and that is something that is too taboo to be allowed under the Hays Code. And it's a similar kind of thing with queer coding. You couldn't have queer characters who simply existed because they were fully realized queer people on screen. It was tied into this idea of motivation. Characters could appear queer in certain ways, whether that was through cross-dressing, whether that was through their sexual desires, but they couldn't simply exist that as a person. It had to be for a reason. And more often than not, queerness was used in film in order to create this underlying sense of a sinister character, to underline being a villain, for example. And if you will see, a lot of people have kind of spoken about this in other mediums, definitely sort of Disney films of the Disney Renaissance of the 1990s come to mind, where people have outlined how certain characters act in a way that is particularly flamboyant or addressed in a particular way, that we would perhaps look at that and ascribe a element of queerness to them, but it's not being used to denote this character as a queer person. It's instead being used to denote a sense of villainy, to make them kind of the antithesis of what is the good and the heroic, which on screen and film tends to be the heterosexual cis normative. So when I speak of queer coding, I speak of characters that have queer characteristics, not because they are queer characters, but because it is trying to denote something about them that is sinister and unfortunately evil. So to look at how queer coding intersects with the history of classics and classical topics on film, so classics and Greek mythology, Roman Greek history as a whole, have really inspired film and television for many, many years, looking at the Italian silent films to Hollywood blockbusters to more modern media such as recent video games and such. The classical world has always been a source of great inspiration for film and television makers. Quite a famous and well-known film is the 1959 Ben-Hur film directed by William Wyler. It's a very long biblical epic and also quite a well-renowned film even today. But when we look at this film now, we can see elements of queer coding in this film. So to summarize the plot of it would take a very long time because it's a awfully long film, but the main source of conflict is between the two characters we have on screen here, Masala, who is on the left, and Judah Ben-Hur, who is on the right. And it's all brought up with a conflict between these two. Ben-Hur goes on to do a number of, fascinating things, becoming a slave on a galleon ship. He meets Jesus. He eventually returns to Rome. There's a very famous chariot scene, and he is redeemed. But the source of this conflict is where we see this element of queer coding. So we know that the two men were once close, were once friends, and that something that goes unspoken has occurred between them and has caused quite a level of conflict and dislike between the two. So what possibly could this be? Well, in an interview with Gore Vidal, who was one of the writers on Ben-Hur, this interview was for a documentary film called The Celluloid Closet in 1995. Gore Vidal was responsible for a lot of the extensive changes that were made to the writing of the script for Ben-Hur. And in the underspoken subtext of the film, he produced this idea that the motivation for this quarrel between Ben-Hur and Masala is framing as a lover's quarrel, and that Masala is a man who is, if not in love, at least sexually attached to Ben-Hur, and that Ben-Hur has now refused his advances. And this is the cause of a lot of this tension that really is quite ruinous, and it leads to, the destruction of Ben-Hur's family unit and causes a lot of the problems that project the plot of this film forward. So he deliberately asserts this during a later interview, sort of retroactively, that this is what he crafted, was this homosexual subtext, that he instructed the actor Stephen Boyd to play Masala as a spurned homosexual lover. But this claim is debated. The director of the film would go on to say that he had no idea of this. Vidal says that he said this to Boyd on the quiet, and that Charlton Heston was unaware of this, perhaps for good reason. Charlton Heston in his later life was quite a gun-toting Republican, so I think the idea of playing part of what was a gay love triangle would probably not have appealed to him. But certainly the crafting of Masala and his motivations as being something that is linked with queer sexual jealousy is really crafting him as the villain while coding him as a queer individual, and contributes to this idea of queerness on screen having a wider motivation to depict quite a negative negative state of being. He's there to be the antithesis of the hero, who is the seemingly heterosexual masculine Ben-Hur, and he is really there to act as his opposite and a problem to be overcome, which, if we are to take Gore Vidal's word that this is the love triangle that he instructed, is all linked into this idea of the abhorrentness of queerness and how queerness is proving to be problematic for the hero of this film. There are several other examples from the many classically inspired films that were produced during this era, another extremely famous one being the 1960 Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Spartacus is a film really about bodies, about enslavement, and about how we kind of can view bodies as being almost allegorical of invasion of wider land and culture. It's the possession of these bodies through physical enslavement is sort of a wider metaphor almost for Rome overtaking places, and the bodies in Spartacus are often on display. They're very virulently masculine, but that comes juxtaposed to the real position of these men within the narrative. Of course, they are marginalized, they are enslaved, which is not apparent when you look at how strong, masculine they are. You think this is coming from a place of strength, and yet they are sort of subverted. They are the enslaved, they are the weak component of the enslaving body of Rome. When we see a scene in the film where the slave owner, the slave marketer, is inspecting these gladiators to purchase, he's speaking of them in quite a licentious manner. He's looking at them and making comments on their stature, on their body hair, almost as if he is making a comment on what he would look for in a lover, as much as he is making a comment on what he would look for to be one of his slaves. In a later scene in the film that was originally cut from the 1960 release but restored in 1990, the character of Crassus, who is played by Laurence Olivier, has a moment with one of his own slaves, Antoninus, played by Tony Curtis, and the whole scene is put through very metaphorically. So when he's speaking to his slave, he's in quite an intimate moment. His slave Antoninus is bathing him. It's quite an intimate scene. When we first see it, the viewer, we are looking from behind a sheer curtain. So it's given an almost erotic framing with this sheer curtain, but it's still something that is almost seen as being shameful with this half kind of obscured. And in quite an interesting line, he says to his slave, "Do you consider the eating of oysters to be moral and the eating of snails to be immoral?" So rather than be a question about dietary preferences, what this is really getting at is that we are expected to see the eating of snails as being euphemistic. Sorry, eating of oysters is euphemistic for heterosexual unions, that being moral, and the eating of snails is euphemistic for homosexual unions, this being something that is then immoral. And in asking his young slave this, he's trying to ascertain whether or not this slave is sexually available in a homosexual role. Of course, the history of sexual dynamics between the enslaved and masters in the Roman Republic is that really there would be no choice in the matter, and that sexual preference really did not come into this because this was a forced sexuality. It was a mark of enslavement and not a mark of any sort of queer identity. But certainly here, Crassus is being interpreted as a queer coded being. He's asking if somebody is interested in passive homosexual sex, but this is coded as something that is immoral. You know, the euphemism is to be eating snails. But this is not something that good people engage in. In fact, this is a threat almost, because we see the young Antoninus run away. So homosexual sexual unions here are being used in their most threatening form. And again, Crassus Olivier here is the antithesis of Spartacus. He is the villain in this piece. And conversely, when we see Spartacus throughout, his sexuality is much more restrained, much more permissive, because it's a heterosexual union that is not reliant on any kind of, queer euphemism. It's far more straight-laced. So with all this in mind, we kind of move forward to looking at what will be the main case study, which I will look at in a moment. But the swords and sandals genre, as it's kind of called, had a bit of a resurgence in the early 2000s. So we see a number of films that came out in a similar time. So we have Gladiator, Troy, 300, all came in with about a 6-year span of each other. And these are all kind of built on modern political machinations, but it's taking into account the long history of these, these swords and sandals epics, such as Ben-Hur, such as Spartacus. And when we look at these films, what we see is that they are constructing their hero in a very typical cis heteronormative performative masculinity, and they in some cases construct their villain in a way that is very much in line with queer coding. So for example, in Gladiator, we have our main protagonist who really sort of, he aligns himself with his patriarchal heterosexual being. He, quite famously introduces himself as, father of a murdered son, husband of a murdered wife. So he is this embodiment of the successful, allowable, cis male masculine sexuality. When we compare that with, I suppose, the film's main villain, which would be the Emperor Commodus, although he's not overtly showing signs of homosexuality, he's dressed very extravagantly. When you look at his armor is all very decorative and not for show, and it contrasts quite starkly with the much more simple and plain dressing of all the other characters. So he's definitely marked out by his excess, his flamboyant dress. He doesn't show any signs of queer sexuality, but he certainly shows signs of taboo sexuality with his, very near the knuckle pseudo-incestuous interest in his poor sister. Again, with Troy is a film where there really are it's not so much a story of heroes and villains, but a lot of people speak on Troy for its lack of any queer coding or queer representation. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, which you will see criticized quite a lot in how it has been quite sanitized, instead of the idea of them being potentially lovers, which is a part of history that you will see often, as Achilles and Patroclus are put forth as potentially, male lovers from antiquity. Here instead, that's completely eroded and sanitized, and we are presented instead with a hero who is undeniably straight. A lot of the nudity that we see in Troy is male nudity, but it's male nudity through heterosexual unions. It's often just before having sex with women or just after having sex with women. Our introduction to Brad Pitt's Troy is him kind of post-coital and looking very, the epitome of the masculine man. And 300 is another case study that is unfortunately very interesting, even though it's not, quite a complex and quite a terrible film in many ways. But the main villain of 300 is the Persian king Xerxes. But really, the Xerxes of 300 fame is not like anything that is reconcilable with the ancient history tradition whatsoever. We can see an image here, which is screen cap taken from the film. We see a man who is completely stripped of any normal clothing, and he is extremely bejeweled. There are facial piercings, there are, chest chains, all golden. It presents this image that is so extravagant and so much a parody of excess. It's feminized in a sense that we are seeing an excess of jewelry, but there's also a sense of being an agender being. He's kind of have no hair. He is a very confusing visual language in terms of gender presentation, because there is absolutely no hair. He has a masculine body, but it is embellished and bejeweled in a sense that we may expect from women. And on commentary of this film, the director has kind of acknowledged that this was part of a deliberate program of visual language to make him seem as intimidating and as completely opposite to the very, straight-laced, very masculine Spartans. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, he says the scenes of a bejeweled, long-fingernailed Xerxes offering King Leonidas peace in exchange for submission have a decidedly sexual undertone. Snyder says that's not accidental, that it's intended to make young straight males in the audience uncomfortable. Snyder says, what's more scary to a 20-year-old boy than a giant god king who wants to have his way with you? So we see Xerxes as being coded as queer in terms of his dress, in terms of his behavior, the way that he approaches the other male characters with a bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge undertone. When he asks for submission, he's not just asking for submission in terms of military submission, he's asking for a sexual submission also. And while there's definitely reason to see sexual violence as something that is terrifying and threatening, really what is being weaponized here in this film is not necessarily sexual violence, but it is the idea of queerness. It is the idea of a character who is agender in their gender presentation, who has sexual desires towards other men. That is what is being weaponized here, and not just the term of sexual violence. So when we think of queer coding and the motivations for queer coding, this is very much in line with the idea that often characters have been presented on screen in a way that marks them out as being dangerous. Queerness is equal to danger. Extravagance is not equal to masculinity. It very much is following this pattern of modern masculinity, particularly modern American masculinity, where they tend to favor the kind of straight-laced, not very adorned, not very bejeweled, simple masculine man. And whether this portrayal is something that would have been comprehensible to, ancient styles of gender, as Yentl's already very well articulated, ancient gender is something that is far more difficult for us to reconcile with, because they have entirely different concepts of what makes gender presentation masculine or feminine. So, whether an ancient Greek would read Xerxes here as being particularly terrifying through queerness, I'm not so sure, but certainly in terms of how we are taking ancient subject matter and how we are changing it for modern presentation, it's falling in line with our modern gender presentation and deliberately subverting that to make anything that is not atypically cis and straight, anything that is slightly outside of the norm, and to make that something dangerous. So one of the main films that I have looked at and that I find myself coming back to time and time again in terms of queer coding masculinity is understandably Alexander in 2004, directed by Oliver Stone. So this film quite famously made headlines upon its release because a group of Greek lawyers were threatening to take legal action against Oliver Stone against this film, specifically for its depiction of Alexander as a queer individual. I've got a number of select headlines here for you. Legal threat over gay Alexander, too gay for Greeks, bisexual Alexander angers Greeks, breaking ground with a gay movie hero. Now, I think something that this raises a question of, and something that certainly I've been considering in relation to this film, is whether or not the character of Alexander counts as being queer coded, or whether he counts as gay representation, queer representation. There are certainly discussions to be had outside of this talk, but I'm fully well happy to talk about it anytime, on whether the real ancient Alexander could be considered queer, on what we know of his gender and sexuality, and how he existed as a potentially queer figure in antiquity. That's another complicated discussion, but certainly what we have in the reception of Alexander and how Alexander has been constructed much later on in the centuries and the decades is that he comes across as a figure with certainly a lot of queer potential, which is something that Oliver Stone's film definitely realized. But I'm a little bit in two minds about this. I think it's very difficult to construct Alexander as being an example of queer representation. I think instead what we have here is another example of queer coding, but queer coding to a slightly different end. So in an interview with the New York Times, which was the one titled Breaking Ground with a Gay Movie Hero, Oliver Stone says, Alexander to me is a perfect blend of male, female, masculine, feminine, yin yang. He could communicate with both sides of his nature. So certainly Stone seems aware that in constructing his character of Alexander, there is an element of queerness. There is an element of gender not simply being the binary norm. There is something there to play with, and there's definitely a taking in of both masculine and feminine energies into this character. It's certainly something that he seems to be aware of when he was creating this presentation. And one way in which this is particularly apparent throughout the film is in Alexander's costuming. So there's, prominent modes of thought in queer theory that gender presentation is not always necessarily directly linked to gender, but certainly in the visual language of film, what we can see is the differences between traditionally masculine characters, traditionally feminine characters, how they are dressed, and how the character of Alexander seems to move between the two modes of presentation as the film goes on. So an example here I have on the left from slightly earlier on in the film chronologically. One of the complicated things about Alexander 2004 is that it doesn't always follow a chronology, but in terms of the running time, but certainly in terms of the narrative chronology here, earlier on in the film, we see an Alexander dressed in fairly traditional, masculine, yet ornate regalia for what the Macedonian soldiers were supposed to look like. Of course, historical accuracy here is something that can't necessarily be ascertained, but when it comes to talking about classical films, historical accuracy never really yields quite a productive conversation. It's a bit unfair to ask for accuracy when they're creating a piece of reception. So whether or not this is really what masculine attire looked like for the Macedonians is a question for another time, but certainly with comparing him to his peers, earlier on in his campaigns and in his life, Alexander suits this mode of masculine heterosexuality to an extent, in that he is depicting himself using the same kind of dress and costume as his peers. There's nothing here that is anything out of the norm. But as time goes on, and as we see Alexander progress in his campaigns and in his life, he starts to adopt a very different style of dress. So in an image that we see here on the right, this is an Alexander after he has engaged in these Persian campaigns and after he has started to take on aspects of Persian dress and culture. And here Stone is using this to show he's becoming different. What is interesting about Alexander 2004 is that it's only really Alexander and Hephaestion who start to change their mode of dress to become more Persianized. His Macedonian fellows and his peers, staunchly do not change their style of dress. During a argument between Alexander and Clytus in a scene of the film, Clytus retorts to him, "Let me rot in Macedonian rags rather than shine in Eastern pomp." So the rest of his men are maintaining they do not want to assimilate to any aspect of Persian culture. They would rather, remain in their very plain, more masculine attire than they would to take on any of the more extravagant dress. So in the visual language of Alexander Thor, we have Macedonian nature is being very much equated with masculinity, whereas the Persian nature and Persian style is more equated with femininity. So we have this equation of femininity and barbarism, whereas Greekness, Hellenicness is being very much cast as the masculine here. But we see Alexander starts to shift between the two the more time goes on. So another question in Alexander's 2004, outside of the issue of gender presentation, is certainly the issue of sexuality. So ancient Greek sexuality was very different to how we perceive it now. There is really a question to be asked on whether Alexander's sexual preferences could even be considered queer, given that male-male homosexual bonds, especially in a military context, were not that abnormal by any stretch of the imagination. But when watching the film, almost the answer is hidden within the film itself. So in a scene with Aristotle, who is teaching the young Alexander, played by the late, great Christopher Plummer, he says to young Alexander and his companions, when they are asking about the story of Achilles and Patroclus and about the love between them, "When men lie together in lust, it is a surrender to the passion and does nothing for the excellence in us. But when men lie together and knowledge and virtue is passed between them, that is pure and excellent. When they compete to bring out the good in each other, this is the love that can build a city-state and lift us from our frog pond." And at first glance, it's just one of the many scenes in Alexander 2004, one of the many flashbacks to Alexander's childhood. But what becomes more interesting about this scene with hindsight is how it really illuminates the narrative program of Alexander's sexuality for the entire film. So here it outlines two ways of having homosexual attachments. You have, on the one side, when men lie together in lust and surrender to passions. That's not excellent. It does nothing for us. But then on the other side, when men lie together with knowledge and virtue passed between them, that is pure and excellent. And it's definitely a callback to this idea of classical pederasty, where a lot of that was supposed to be a form of education for the younger man, that he would have this intimate and sexual bond with an older man, not just for sexual gratification, but also for education, character building, that kind of thing. But when we look at Alexander and his presumed lover Hephaestion over the course of the film, they're of a peer group. It's not a pederastic relationship, but what it is it's a relationship that falls along the line of knowledge, virtue, and excellence. And it's part of the reason why I consider Alexander to be more of a queer-coded character in this film, rather than an example of queer representation, is that even Alexander's gender presentation, Alexander's sexuality, it all serves a wider program of what are the motivations for these reasons. Alexander's intimate relationship with Hephaestion is one that dominates a lot of the film, but not quite as much as his intimate relationship with Bagoas. Now, a lot of this material was originally taken out of the original theatrical release in 2004, possibly due to the pressure, as we saw, from legal challenges, perhaps just to cut down the runtime. But in the longer extended cut of Alexander's 2004, a lot more time is given to developing this relationship between Alexander and the eunuch Bagoas, played by Francisco Bosch, who he first meets when he takes over Babylon and gets entry to the harem. And it's quite an interesting scene where he gains entry to the harem, and there are a lot of beautiful women there who are kind of smiling at them, ready to be there to entertain them. And Alexander, very titillated by this. There's scenes of embraces between the men and the beautiful Persian women. Alexander, however, completely ignores these Persian women, and he makes a beeline towards this character, which is the eunuch Bagoas, who does appear in the ancient Alexander source tradition, but his role is greatly expanded upon by later literature. I think of the novels by Mary Renaud, for example, who kind of flesh him out into a larger character and more of a lover to Alexander the Great. And this is the tradition that this film is definitely picking up on, is that Bagoas becomes very much a lover to Alexander the Great. In the more extended scene, we see more intimate scenes. We've seen them. We see one of the two sex scenes in the film, one between Alexander and his wife, and one between Alexander and Bagoas. But the framing of this relationship is what strikes me as it being an example of queer coding rather than an example of queer representation, because all of Alexander's dalliances with Bagoas seem to be part of this wider motif of him losing sense of his Macedonianness, losing sense of his masculinity. He starts to dress more like Bagoas rather than he does like the other Persian men that we meet. Instead, he takes on the characteristics of his lover, who is a more gender ambiguous figure. And quite interestingly, over the course of the film, in this love scene that he has with Bagoas, that is directly intercut with a scene where he has his former general Parmenion murdered and killed off. So he's quite literally jumping into bed with the Persians whilst having his own men, put by the wayside. So as he's indulging in this relationship, it's one of lust, it's one of passion, it's one that's definitely not serving him in terms of his wider goals of conquest and maintaining his men by his side. And it's this queer relationship with Bagoas that seems to be a direct challenge to that. The scene that I mentioned earlier, where Clytus the Black has this outburst and says that he would rather stay in his Macedonian rags than wear all the Persian finery, that is in a scene slightly preceding this, which I have a screen cap of here on the right. We see Alexander embracing Bagoas publicly. Again, this is something that is attested in the historical sources, but here Oliver Stone is kind of shifting around the chronology a little bit to have his embrace of Bagoas happen directly before Clytus's outburst. So Clytus's outburst is not just a complaint against Alexander's gender presentation taking on a new sort of Persian and feminized dynamic, but it's also an outburst against his intimate relationship with a Persian individual. On the flip side to this, we have Alexander's relationship with Hephaestion. And when we think back to the model of relationships presented by Aristotle, we have the one which is the indulgence of lust and passions, which does nothing for us. And that is definitely encapsulated by Alexander's relationship with Bagoas, which again is kind of metaphorical for this losing losing your sense of Persianness and losing your sense of masculinity as you engage in these queer relationships, something that is dangerous and sort of antithetical to the ultimate aims. But then on the other side, you have this relationship with Hephaestion. They spend a lot of time together over the course of the film, but again, the relationship is not something that is truly queer representation. They never really seem to speak about each other or exist as normal people. Whenever they have these intimate relationships, it's always intercut with more grander conversations about these ideas of conquest, about these ideas of city building. Whenever he speaks to Hephaestion, he speaks to him as much as a lover as he does speak to him as a partner in this grand scheme. A lot of their love and a lot of their intimacy is tied up in this wider idea of noble conquest, which is, again, quite an outdated idea of how we view Alexander's conquests, but it comes back to this idea of queerness and motivation. The motivation for Alexander's changing gender presentation is not just to make a comment about how he adopts more Persian culture by intercutting it with these scenes and showing that Alexander's becoming more like the eunuch Bagoas than he is like the other Persian males. His Persianization is also becoming a type of feminization over the course of the film. And in his personal relationships with Bagoas, we're not just seeing a queer intimate relationship, it's showing us the dangers of indulging in lust and passions, as was outlined by this rather prophetic monologue now by Aristotle. And equally, Alexander's relationship with Hephaestion over the course of this film, it's more prophetic of this idea of conquest and empire. As Hephaestion lays dying in the film, Alexander is busy speaking about his grand plans, his grand ideas for the future. And it seems that when Hephaestion dies, these plans for empire also die. So really what we see in Alexander is not so much a character who is an example of queer representation, but it's more following in this line of tradition of queer coding, much like how in Spartacus and in Ben-Hur, the villains of those films were coded by their queer attraction, by their queer styling. In Alexander, we have not quite the villain of the film. He is still our hero of the film, but his queerness is part of his character flaw and ultimately part of his undoing, whether that is how he alienates his Macedonian peers, which leads to the downfall of his greater plans, or whether it's his love for his male companions. It's more part of a wider program of queering him with a particular motivation rather than representing him as being an authentically queer character on screen. But thank you very much.
Thank you. You've just heard from Meg Finlayson and her presentation on queer coding and constructing masculinity in classical film. If you've enjoyed this think tank and want to see other materials related to it, follow our social media links, which you can see on screen now, for more news on our think tanks, crash courses and summer schools. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.